it is possible that the government someday might try to take our gold again, but I have to say that it would not be so easy. Most Americans wouldn't give the government their gold anyway.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira, part of Silver Bullion's outreach team here in Singapore, where we want to help you truly secure your wealth. Dr. Lawrence Reed joins us today. Dr. Reed became president of the Foundation for Economic Education, known as FEE, back in 2008, after serving as chairman of its board of trustees in the 1990s. He previously served for 21 years as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan, and also taught economics full time at Northwood University in Michigan and chaired its Department of Economics. In May of 2019, Dr. Reed retired to the role of President Emeritus at FEE and assumed the titles of Humphreys Family Senior Fellow and Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty. And it's been said that Dr. Reed is a rarity in the liberty movement. We're delighted to have Dr. Lawrence Reed join us here again today. It's time to saddle up and silver up for Dr. Reed. Dr. Reed, welcome back to SBTV. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Patrick, and I hope you are too. Thanks again for having me.
I'm doing great. Thank you. And thank you for asking. It's good to see you again.
Yes, same here.
You wrote an article earlier in April titled FDR's Other Day of Infamy, when the US government seized all citizens' gold. And this event happened some 90 years ago, and within the precious metals community there is concern that it could one day happen again. And Dr. Reed, what were the dynamics of what led to this gold confiscation or expropriation back in 33?
Well, the gold confiscation that FDR engineered by executive order on April 5, 1933, is one of the saddest moments in American economic history because it demolished what was left of the gold standard, and it would be in tatters until Richard Nixon, 40 years later, ended that tenuous connection. But the background to it is that we were amidst the Great Depression, near the bottom of it, as a matter of fact, in early 1933. Franklin Roosevelt had just won election in 1932, defeating the incumbent Herbert Hoover. And FDR ran on a platform of defending the integrity of the dollar, cutting federal spending by 25%, all the things that he thought would get him votes, even though once he took office, he really didn't have much intention of carrying those things out. He did just the opposite in most cases. He doubled spending in his first term instead of cutting it, as he promised, by one quarter. But he took office on March 4th, 1933. And within a few days, he made a pronouncement about the integrity of the currency and that the gold backing of it was not in any danger, that America had the largest gold reserves in the world. And then 3 days after that, about March 11, as I recall, he ordered that the banks stop gold payments, which really is the proximate cause of the bank run of March and April of 1933. People thought, what? The banks can't pay gold in exchange for the paper money that says right on it, payable to the bearer on demand, a certain specified quantity of gold. So he prompted a run on gold intentionally. And then on April 5, seizing upon the run as a reason, he then issued this sweeping executive order that confiscated the monetary gold of all Americans. You had less than a month until May 1st to turn in all your monetary gold. In other words, you didn't have to take the gold out of your teeth, but any legal tender gold coins you had to turn in to the government at a specified price by the 1st of May under penalty of $10,000 in fines or 10 years in prison or both.
Dr. Reed, I want to touch on a few points that you just mentioned here. And one of them is the part of the reason for that gold confiscation was that people were hoarding gold and they were preventing the recovery from that Great Depression. In your historic view, was this true?
Yeah, this is one of the most amazing arguments. I mean, think of it on the face of it to charge that Americans are hoarding gold, so the government therefore must come in and take it from them, and then do what? Hoard it itself. I mean, what did the government do once it took your gold? It didn't then redistribute it all across the country. It hoarded it. It did the very thing it accused people of doing. But the reason that people were holding on to gold was Roosevelt's order to the banks of a month before. I mean, he was the one who, on the one hand, said, you know, don't worry, we have plenty of gold, biggest reserves in the world. And then 3 days later, ordered the banks to stop making payments in gold. He was the one that did that. And hey, if my bank had promised me gold anytime I brought forth a gold certificate, and all of a sudden, the president intervenes and says, no, banks, don't give him that gold. And you can bet that I would be trying to get my hands on all of it that I could, because that's not a very good sign for the future integrity of the currency. So Roosevelt caused the run on the banks that he then used as an excuse to do the very thing that he accused people of, which is to hoard the gold. He just wanted the government to hoard it instead of the actual owners, so that it could then be the basis for future expansion of the money supply.
That part there is also pretty interesting because, Roosevelt, as mentioned in your article, he declared that the gold standard to be safe. And as you mentioned, within a few days, within a few days of taking office, uh, he did an about face on policy. He prevented banks from making gold payments, as you said. But the thing is, why did he do that about face? I mean, was he trying to maybe devalue the dollar a bit? Was he just trying to? I mean, what was the reason here for that about face?
Well, of course, he did devalue the dollar. The official rate was $20 to approximately $20.67, I think it was, to for an ounce of gold. And that's what he paid you when he took your gold. But then once he got it, he then immediately devalued it to $35 an ounce, which was rather duplicitous right from the start. But his main purpose in doing this, and by the way, I should point out that Roosevelt was not some economic whiz. Even his closest economic and financial advisors, in their candid moments, admitted to that many times. His Treasury Secretary expressed shock at how Roosevelt determined the price of gold over eggs in at breakfast in bed. And his financial advisor, James Warburg, wrote a book called Hell Bent for Election after he realized that Roosevelt had disavowed every major pledge that he made. He wrote a book about how this is a guy who doesn't know anything about economics. And so he was not an economic whiz, but he knew that he wanted to buy a lot of votes. He wanted to spend like crazy. He wanted to, as he ended up doing, double spending in his first term, even though he promised the opposite. And he couldn't do that if the dollar was still tied to gold, because people would flee into gold and away from paper money if the government was that irresponsible. So he was effectively closing an escape hatch to the American people in preparation for an expansion of paper money.
Right. So we heard the story where Roosevelt he blamed the people hoarding gold for the Great Depression. But I mean, really, if that was the case, I mean, the U.S. Mint in 33 legislation was passed where the U.S. Mint stopped producing gold coins, and the legislation also banned private ownership of gold coins and bullion. And it didn't change until 74. But the mint no longer used gold for circulating coinage. So my question here is, once the Great Depression was over, why didn't we go back to circulating gold coins?
Well, incidentally, in 1933, even though Roosevelt made it illegal for you and I to own monetary gold, he did not make it illegal for trade among central banks. So if you happen to be lucky enough to be a central banker, you could deal in gold, you could pile it up if you wanted, but individual Americans could not. I think that's an important point that we should make. Good question. Why didn't we go back to gold quickly after the Depression was over? Which, by the way, didn't end with Roosevelt's tinkering. It lingered for years afterwards. He didn't end the Depression. Other things did. But uh, once a nation makes such a sweeping move of any kind, it isn't easy to turn around, especially if people have grown relatively comfortable with the situation you've created. By the end of the Second World War, Americans had other things on their mind than the composition of their money. They didn't fully understand why it was important to retie it to gold. There wasn't an organized lobby for several years yet until the 1970s that would champion the re-legalization of it. So there wasn't a lot of pressure on the politicians in the late 40s to undo that. And there was a consensus among the economics profession, having fallen under the sway of John Maynard Keynes from Britain in the 1930s, that government should have more monetary power, that it is a good thing for it to stimulate the economy through the manufacture of more money. And a return to gold would prevent that. We wouldn't be able to have chronic big deficits and the printing of money and the spending of it like, well, they say drunken sailors, but last time I used that phrase, I had some sailors rightfully object to that. The government was far worse. So there just wasn't pressure to go back to it, and really hasn't been since, with the exception of the move to get the government to re-legalize the private ownership of it that succeeded in the 1970s.
If you're enjoying this interview with Dr. Lawrence Reed and I, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. And if you would like to learn more about systemic wealth protection, please do visit us at www.silverbullion.com.sg. Yeah, that happened, I believe, with Gerald Ford back in '74. So, I mean, that kind of also led to the question where, uh, why make it legal again? I mean, after all these years, it wasn't legal. Then all of a sudden, hey, okay, it's legal to have again. I mean, what's your opinion on why they gave it back to us?
Well, there always has been in America a sizable contingent of people, at one time probably a clear majority, who instinctively understand the importance of sound money. And this goes back even to the days when America, early in its conflict with Great Britain in the 1770s, printed its way through the destruction of the continental dollar. And of course, the southern states printed their way to the destruction of Confederate money. And even during the Civil War in the North, the North printed paper money and it lost half of its value. So Americans have had experience, as many other countries have too, with what happens when the government begins to manufacture money en masse, when it isn't tied to something that exerts a discipline on the politicians. So instinctively, a lot of Americans kind of know that, and the old phrase, as the dollar is as good as gold, that was always viewed as a very positive thing. So, but not until the late 60s, early 70s did you have the emergence of private and nonprofit organizations that would mount a campaign to convince the government to re-legalize gold. I'm very happy to say that a key figure, maybe the chief figure in that movement, was a man I worked for as chief economist for a couple of years, James Blanchard of New Orleans. He formed a committee to legalize gold. I think that was the name of it, and convinced a lot of people and ultimately Congressman and President Ford that it was time to end this archaic and destructive ban on the private ownership of gold. By that point, the paper money regime was so firmly ensconced that even in government, a lot of people thought, oh, let the peasants have their gold. We're in charge anyway, so what? So we finally got it again, and it should never have been taken away in the first place.
Right. Dr. Reed, in your article, I believe it was James Bovard that was quoted when he said Roosevelt was hailed as a visionary and a savior for his repudiation of the government's gold commitment, and citizens who distrusted the government's currency management or integrity were branded as social enemies and their gold was seized. So, Dr. Reed, I want to ask you here, is this a dangerous precedence where we will simply follow a government instead of question a government?
Yes, I think very much so. And, the tactics of the left are monotonously repetitive. If they have it in their minds, as Roosevelt did, an ultimate objective, which is to empower the government to print as much paper money as it wants, then they start that process by figuring out who the opponents might be and making villains out of them, attacking them, saying, "Oh, these are antisocial people," or all sorts of things. And you can always be sure that when they start that they have something else in mind. That villainizing some group is a precursor to some ultimate objective. If they want to get higher taxes, they first villainize the rich or the entrepreneurs or fill in the blank so they can get their money. This is repetitive over and over again. So that's what Roosevelt did then. And it is possible that the government someday might try to take our gold again. But I have to say that it would not be so easy. First of all, for the government to even prove that you have a certain amount would be very difficult, if not impossible in most cases. How do they know how much you've got? We don't have gold registration in the sense that you have gun registration, say, in states. So it would be hard for the government to figure out who's got it, and it's not typically used at the moment anyway, in day-to-day transactions anyway. Um, and I also think that the sentiment in the country about government overreach is such that most Americans wouldn't give the government their gold anyway. I mean, I'm happy to go on public record right now and saying that the government's not going to get mine. They would have a hard time even finding it. And I think most Americans would share that sentiment.
But the situation today, I think it's far different from back then, because back then people were still using gold coins as money, and we're 90 years removed from it, getting close to 100 years removed from having gold coins. So many people today, they don't even know really that gold was money. They probably don't even have much gold. So if the government did try a confiscation event again, how successful do you think they would be? Because this first time around, I think it was only for every gold coin that someone turned in, they kept three or something like that.
Yeah, that's the best estimates that, yeah, or the consensus estimates that for every one they got, the government got, Americans kept three. Of course, we'll never know exactly, but we do know that lots of Americans didn't turn in all their gold, not by a long shot. Um, the problem today is as well that the educational system does not inform Americans about their own history, at least the salient lessons of it. Any lessons that it doesn't want you to learn, it won't teach. And so Americans now are growing up hearing from their teachers so often that, oh, gold is, as John Maynard Keynes once said, a barbarous relic, and we just had to get rid of it so we could do wonderful things. Americans hear that all the time as they're growing up from stupid or biased so-called history teachers. It's widespread. I mean, many of them don't even know that they're biased because they're teaching the bias that they were taught. Uh, and so there has to be a lot of educational work before Americans once again understand the history and the nature of money and of the gold standard. And, maybe that'll happen someday, but it might take some kind of monetary cataclysm before it does.
Dr. Reed, if let's say this gold confiscation event does happen again, how do you think it would look? How do you think it might be played out this time?
Well, for the government to even attempt it, they would have to proclaim some sort of national emergency. That's a common thing in history where the government, if it wants to do something really stupid or destructive, it has to make the case that, oh, conditions are such that we can't help but do it. It's unavoidable. It's the wise thing to do given these extraordinary circumstances. And once those circumstances pass, they usually assure us, then we can go back to normality. As economist and historian Robert Higgs has shown in his book, Leviathan. Oh, what's the title?
Leviathan's good
Oh,
enough for me already.
okay, yeah. Leviathan is in the title, and his name is Robert Higgs. But there's a bit more to the title than I'm remembering at the moment. Anyway, he pointed out in that book what he called the ratchet effect, that every time government reaches to greatly expand, even if it promises that it'll be temporary, the most it will usually end up doing is just retrace a little bit. And then when the next emergency or perceived emergency arises, then they overreach again. And you get this ratchet effect where you never end up back at normality. Every circumstance, every emergency is a reason for government to get bigger, and it never goes back to as small as it previously was.
Yeah, Dr. Reed, speaking of normality, what President Roosevelt did back then, it wasn't executive order. He did that without any input from Congress. But say if Congress did have some input where there was a bill or of sorts that were going through Congress, there was a debate, there was a vote. In your opinion, would the confiscation still have happened?
That's a good question. Whenever there's a crisis atmosphere, real or imagined, and it was both in 1933, being the midst of the Great Depression, then people tend to accept more than they will in normal times. So if it had been presented to the Congress as a bill and debated, I don't know. It might have passed because Roosevelt had big Democratic majorities at the time. And of course, he didn't want anything like that because that would just, all during the course of such a debate, you'd have people saying, oh my gosh, if he gets this through, he's going to swipe our gold. Let's go bury it or let's get more. It would have exacerbated the situation that he proclaimed to be an emergency. And so he felt he had to do it quick and unannounced and without congressional approval. But that's not the way a free society should work. I think it would have been a very stupid and unwise and anti-liberty move to make, whether it was done by executive order or by act of Congress. I would have opposed it either way. But at least if you put it through Congress, you give the people's representatives a chance to discuss it and debate it. But it only made his order all the worse, the fact that he did it just by decree, as if he was the emperor.
Right, that's a great point. Had this ever come up in Congress, I think there would have been a lot of what they call midnight gardening happening in people's backyards.
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Rita, a few members though in Congress, they were against the gold confiscation back in 1933, and as mentioned, uh, they called it stealing. They called it dishonor, and but today in Congress, we have seen senators calling for a bill that would let the US Mint alter the metal content of the coins today to save money. So, how do we label this government confiscation of things that may hold wealth for us, such as perhaps maybe whatever's left, nickel or copper, which is going to have even more monetary debasement?
Yeah, it's a sad commentary, isn't it, on the decline in moral standards and moral alertness that back in the 1930s, you still had people who would raise moral arguments. It's simply wrong to confiscate people's gold. Not aside from whatever the economic benefits or hazards may be, it's just not right. But today, that argument would be made maybe by Rand Paul in the Senate and a handful in the House, and that's pretty much it. Because most people today are moral relativists. They think, hey, if it feels good, do it. If the ends are justified by the means, well, why would you not do it? So that's a sad commentary. I wish that. Let me put it this way: any nation that abandons moral principle and puts in its place political expediency and elevates politicians and concentrates power in the process is in serious trouble. And that's not just my observation or my principle. It is one of the salient lessons of all of human history going back thousands of years. It never ends well. So, but you'll have to remind me, Patrick, I may have gotten off on the side there. What, remind me in your question.
Yeah. No, it was back then in 33 there were a couple of senators
Oh,
who
yeah.
they had the morals. They were against it, calling it dishonor, basically stealing.
Yeah.
Um but today we hear news where the Congress is going to allow the US Mint to remove the nickel, remove the copper in what's left of coins that may have any type of a store of wealth, so to
Yeah.
speak. And and so really, I mean, it just we kind of fast forward today. We hear all the stories about how Rome fell, through debasement. A lot of countries fell through debasement, and here we are, where Congress is going to allow it to happen.
Yeah. This process of debauching the currency, of reducing its precious metal content, has been going on for decades. Even after Roosevelt's move in 1933, and even after Nixon's break of the last remaining tenuous linked to gold in 1971, we still had uh, some precious metal in our coins, although really by 1971 they'd begun to disappear. It was in the 60s now that we began taking the silver out of our subsidiary coinage. Um, so it was 1964 was the last year in American history when our dimes and our quarters and our half dollars were 90% silver. And then that was reduced, uh, overnight. The only silver we had left was in the Kennedy half dollar, and it was only 40%, and that was ended in 1969. So we've been taking the precious metal out of our currency just as ancient Rome did and so many other civilizations when the government wants to spend. We've been doing that for a long time, and I can't think of an instance in history where it ended well. It gives the government enormous monetary power and paves the way for inflation and the erosion of the value of the monetary unit every time.
Yeah, it's a great point there, because we already see, this unabated money printing, and they're trying to burn off some of it, but it surely looks like it's going to come back, and inflation may be, or at least disinflation might be on the books, where we'll still go down but still have higher prices. Um, Dr. Reed, I want to give you an example of the penalties that were dished out back in 33, where as you mentioned, people had 1 month to turn in their gold, uh, gold coins, bullions, even the certificates, or else they faced up to 10 years in prison or a $10,000 fine, or both. So what I did was I went and researched some uh, some fines, or some laws, I should say, if you break, that you will get 10 years or less today, prison time. One of them being assault of a pregnant woman resulting in termination of pregnancy, you'll get 10 years. Kidnapping, you'll get 10 years. Employing a minor underage, 10 years. Home invasion, 10 years. Basically, these are examples today what would get you equal time behind bars if you held a gold coin back in 33. So it leads me to the question, who's the real criminal here? I mean, regarding gold confiscation, was it the government, or the person hanging on to his gold, his money?
Well, the answer is rather obvious, isn't it? The real criminal was the government in its seizure, and the victim was the guiltless citizen. What's the crime here? Who is the victim? I mean, there was no crime in holding gold. No one was hurt by it. But if it was something that you preserved your wealth in, you got hurt. You became a victim when the government took it from you at the price that it dictated to be fair. So, yeah, the real criminal here was the government. We should point out too that something else happened in 1933 that tells you where Roosevelt's values were. He supported the repeal of prohibition, And I would have been with him on that. I think prohibition of alcohol was utterly ineffective. But by the end of 1933, it became legal again to purchase and to produce alcoholic beverages. So if you could wind your mental clock back, let's say to early 1934, 34, if two men are walking down the street, one has a gold coin in his pocket and the other one has a bottle of whiskey in his hand. The crook was the guy with the gold coin, and the citizen who was perfectly in accord with the law was the one with the bottle of booze. A year before, it was just the opposite. The guy with the gold coins was the upstanding citizen, and the guy with the booze was the crook.
Boy, times have changed for sure. I'll wrap it up with that, Dr. Reed. Before we let you go, can you let our listeners know more about your work and where they can find more of your views?
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I have a website where I put all of my articles. The great majority of them are published at fee.org, but my website, if you want to see my stuff in one place, is lawrencewreed.com. And there you'll see the articles I publish at Fee and other places as well. So I hope people will visit the website and you can learn more about me and see in the blog section 1 to 3 new articles every week.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for valuable insight and explanation of history. And because history does often tell what the future may hold. So I hope we can do this again soon, and let's all hope for the best.
My pleasure. Thank you, Patrick.
That was Dr. Lawrence Reed, President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education. For more of his information and his work and his views on the economy, please visit his website, www.fee.org. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on new content. And also check out the SBTV podcast on iTunes and Spotify.